Does anyone know what the impervious value of artificial turf is? We almost made this like the #1 FAQ on our website. I cannot tell you how many people have asked us about this. So it's really nice to be getting into kind of a deep dive on an area of our criteria manual that's due for an update, and that is the runoff chapter. So please welcome Andrew Earles with Wright and Brik Zivkovich, project engineer with the district.
Thank you, Holly. Hello, everyone. I'm Brik Zivkovich. This is Dr. Andrew Earles with me. We're going to present about imperviousness. So hydrologists love it, developers hate it, and I think that's, we're going to go from there. So real quickly, just kind of a quick overview of the presentation. We are going to talk about kind of some of the updates that we're going to see in the newest runoff chapter, Volume 1, Chapter 6. And then along with some of the research that we've done to evaluate imperviousness, runoff coefficients. We've got a lot of feedback from the stakeholders and others about certain questions about what do I use for this type of surface, and hey, is this correct here and there? But then incorporating other land uses too, so things such as xeriscaping and so on, as well as some of the work that I presented on last year, this water quality event, and kind of looking at that in more than just a volume perspective, but also a flow perspective. So thank you all for the feedback. We love answering your questions, so keep sending them in. But I think the biggest things here for the runoff chapter that we're going to touch on in the presentation here, we're really going to touch on the first three, is understanding that imperviousness, it means different things whenever we're talking about a master plan versus a site plan. And so how do we calculate those? What values do we use for other types of impervious surfaces that we commonly don't have included in the criteria manual now? As well as this incorporation of the water quality event to kind of find water quality peak flows that will correspond to some of the designs that we need for stormwater control measures. And then these other two we're not going to have a chance to touch on today, but we do look forward to some of your comments and feedback, and we'll provide some information at the end. So,
thanks, Brik. I have my own. Oh, thank you. Oh, sorry. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm going to spend a few minutes today talking to you about some recent work that we've been doing related to imperviousness values and runoff coefficients. And I wanted to start by kind of polling the group by raising your hands. How many people feel like you really know the basis of the runoff coefficients and impervious values that you're using? I see a few people, but not a whole lot. And that's not surprising because, you know, a lot of these values or coefficients or values we look up in tables. In many cases, they were derived decades ago. And that's one reason why we're helping the Mile High Flood District right now take another look at imperviousness and runoff coefficients. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we assess imperviousness and runoff coefficients for development projects at different scales. And I'm also going to talk about some new types of land uses that we're working on determining what appropriate values to use for runoff coefficients are. And so we really have two different approaches, and I think many of the practicing engineers already know this, but we really want to drive this home in the update of the chapter, and that is that there are different approaches at a master planning level than there are at a site development level. You know, if you're doing master planning, especially in a greenfield watershed, you probably don't know what all of the future land uses are precisely. You probably know how they're zoned, but you may not know, you know, that the building is here, what are the dimensions of the building, how wide is this road, how wide is that road. And so really, at a master plan stage, what we really do is that we use what we call land use-based imperviousness values to derive runoff coefficients. And for those of you who are familiar with Chapter 5 and or the runoff chapter in the Mile High Flood District Manual, you know, you start with an imperviousness value, and then based on that value of imperviousness, the hydrologic soil group, and the design return period of your storm event, you can look up a runoff coefficient, or you can calculate it using equations in the chapter. And that's a really good way to do it at a master planning stage, because oftentimes you're studying hundreds of acres at a time, if not thousands, and you don't really fully understand all of the land use. So that's the first way, is when we really do it at a broad scale at the master planning level. Okay, when you get to a site plan level, though, you know a lot more details. And that level of analysis, we don't want you using single-family residential runoff coefficients because you can actually measure the drive area, the roof area, the sidewalk area, and you can empirically calculate a imperviousness value to find a runoff coefficient. So just to emphasize that a little bit more, this is just kind of showing a typical scale of a master plan, and this is the kind of area that we'd analyze using the Colorado Urban Hydrograph procedure. And this is really where we would be looking at breaking things into land use-based categories. And a lot of times you'll do that based on an underlying land classification layer, like, for example, the National Land Classification Database. And it's really important what layers you're using. And oftentimes you'll want to use whatever layer is available from the local government or a local regulatory agency so that you don't get spurious results. I know I've run into things with NLCD where I've pulled off land uses that just don't really match what I have specific on the ground. And that's not surprising because that's done at a national level. It doesn't really have the same resolution that you get perhaps with more detailed mapping projects at a regional or local level. Then when we get to the site level, well, we can calculate in AutoCAD or whatever programs we're using what actual imperviousness we have. And so when we get to this level of design, whether it's a single site or a subdivision, really what should be being done at that stage is actually calculating what's our area of roads, what's our area of sidewalks, driveways, parking areas, and then you can calculate the imperviousness, and then you can look up a runoff coefficient that's going to be a lot more applicable to your site-specific conditions than if you just use a land use-based coefficient. So, wrong one. So let's talk a little bit about runoff coefficients, and I want to talk about some work we've been doing to kind of vet these. And as I mentioned before, a lot of runoff coefficients are pretty old. I mean, I'm pretty sure that same table has been in the Mile High Flood District's criteria manual since I started as an engineer in 1999. And, but land use patterns have changed, right? In some cases, you can have densification of developments, and one of the things that we've done is we've looked at current land use patterns and recent developments to ask ourselves the question, are these still lining up with our imperviousness assumptions that we have in the manual, given the fact that, you have many places where people are replacing lots, 30,000 square foot lot with 5,000 feet of coverage with 20,000 square feet of coverage on that same lot. And that obviously has a big change on runoff coefficients. So we've done that, and we are helping the city of Aurora, as well as helping the Mile High Flood District update the runoff chapter. We're helping the city of Aurora update their stormwater criteria manual. So we started by doing a lot of these areas, looking at different neighborhoods in Aurora. We've also looked at some in Denver, and we'll be looking at others as we're working to wrap up this chapter. I also do want to emphasize that what I'm presenting today are really draft results. This is still a work in progress, and we'd love to get your input on some of these topics if this is a topic that you're interested in. So, in addition to having densification of some land uses, we also have some land uses that just frankly weren't really around or very prevalent 20 or 30 years ago. And those are things like xeriscaping, which spans a really broad area of different practices, and things like solar fields, which seem to be popping up like mushrooms these days all around because it's a very cost-effective way to generate electricity. It's sustainable. There are a lot of reasons we need those, but good luck finding a runoff coefficient for solar panels in a criteria manual. They just aren't out there really right now. And so what we've done is we've really, first of all, we started by diving into the literature, and we've also looked at a number of different tools. We've benchmarked against other types of manuals that are out there, and we've done some independent analysis. And I think, one thing I really want to point about xeriscaping is that oftentimes we just say, yes, it's xeriscaping. Well, xeriscaping encompasses a really broad category of what can be done. I mean, the common thing is that it uses less water, right? That's why it's xeric landscaping. But it could be everything from gravel mulch to wood mulch to native grasses. And hydrologically, those are going to act very differently. And they're really going to act very differently if you put a weed barrier down beneath your gravel mulch or your wood mulch. In TR 55, guidance for curve numbers, for western desert landscape areas with a weed barrier, the curve number is higher than 90. So they effectively assume those areas are just as imperviousness as driveways. And that's a real big issue when we're figuring out these xeriscaped areas, because whether you have a weed barrier or not makes a big difference. Also, we've started to look at artificial turf. I might be able to give a good guess to the question Holly posed, but again, there's just not a whole lot of literature on that, and the one thing we've found so far from looking into artificial turf is that it really depends on the specific nature of the system. I mean, you can do everything from getting that, roll-off carpet kind of stuff at Home Depot and throwing it on subgrade, which would practically just be like a sidewalk, to heavily engineered systems that have granular bedding. They have under drains that are intended to manage an event, like an athletic field or a big park. And so sometimes there aren't one-size-fits-all answers for these things. Now, another area that we've really been looking at, which is a fairly new land use in recent memory, are solar panels. And, there are a number of tools out there for evaluating runoff from solar fields, but most of those have not been developed for urban areas, and most of them rely on the NRCS curve number method. And so they don't necessarily really capture the short duration types of storms we care about when we have the monsoon season fire up here in Colorado, where you might get 1 inch or 2 inches of rain in 90 minutes. A lot of those are based on daily precipitation values, and they tend to underestimate runoff when you actually are dealing with shorter duration storm events. And the one thing I wanted to show on this, and I'm going to spend just a little bit of time because this is probably something fairly new that a lot of people haven't seen as much of, is that solar panels do alter hydrology, right? You can have ground beneath them that's still pervious, but the panels concentrate runoff. They concentrate that runoff at the drip line. The water falls off the drip line as concentrated flow. It sheets off the panels, but it impacts the ground and has the potential to cause erosion. Furthermore, you have this area that's beneath the panels that we refer to as a rain shadow area, or I think rain shadow is a pretty good word for it, because the rain doesn't fall directly on that area. And in addition, in this picture, you can't see it so well, but I've been visiting a lot of these solar farms lately, and the vegetation doesn't usually look as hot beneath the panels as it does elsewhere. It doesn't get as much water, and it doesn't get as much sun. And so when we're evaluating these things hydrologically, we really need to think about how they behave like disconnected impervious area. And another guy who's here today, Dr. Chris Olson, and myself, and one of our project engineers named Victoria Hennon, have been doing some work to evaluate how this receiving pervious area works and how this disconnection works. And so this is showing you the schematics of how we've modeled this. And essentially what we do is when you look at these areas that are hatched there, the gray is the panel, the green is pervious area, and these are 5 different cases that we evaluated. But the hatched green and gray area, that's the rain shadow area. So we set that up in SWIM. We don't apply any rainfall to it, but it receives rainfall and runoff from the panels and from the interpanel area, the aisles. And what we found when we started looking at this and playing around with slopes is that the panel orientation relative to the slopes is really important, right? If your panels are running parallel to the contours and you can have it sheeting off of one panel and flowing over the aisle and beneath the next panel, you're probably using most of that receiving pervious area beneath the panels, and you'd have a very low runoff coefficient. You probably wouldn't need water quality, and you probably wouldn't need detention. But as soon as you shift that orientation so they're perpendicular or diagonal to the panels, you're not fully utilizing that area beneath the panels, and then you have excess runoff. And the way that many of these solar installations work is they run north to south so that they have an east-west solar exposure. And so unless you're going to do a lot of grading, which we don't like people doing, inevitably you're going to be crossing areas where your panels are parallel, and you're going to be crossing areas where they're perpendicular. And we really need different guidance values for those, which is what we've developed. Okay, so what does all this show? And I might have to zoom in a little because the monitor is kind of small in front of me. But these are just a few comparisons. What I'm going to show you is on the left are what some draft updates to criteria we're considering are, and on the right are the current criteria. And so starting by looking at the residential areas, if you look at really what low density development is on the left side, or medium density, it's 3 to 5 dwelling units per acre. And we're up at 70% or so imperviousness. If you go down to the single family here, you might look at that initially and say, wow, these are a lot higher, but the values on the right-hand side in the current criteria are also much lower density. And so really, if you were to look at the comparable densities, you would find that the runoff coefficients that we're finding for these types of development these days are somewhat higher, but not excessively higher than the current guidance values that we have. Another one we can look at are commercial areas and downtowns, and we've done that, and those values also don't change a whole lot. I mean, plus or minus 5% is not a big change. And so really, the criteria we have for these areas are pretty good right now as well. Okay, but let's look at some other areas. Light industrial, heavy industrial, okay, not much of a change there either. But when we look at some of these categories related to open space, parks, and things, we do see some changes. And I think, one of the things that we realized from doing some of this mapping of imperviousness is that when you have developed parks, with playgrounds, basketball courts, and other things, you can really have some more substantial impervious area, whereas our values that we currently use are a bit lower. The other one, and again, not a big land use in the metro area, but one that's worth getting right, is cemeteries. Previously those were, I think, at around 10%, and when we actually went in and mapped some of these and looked at how many drive aisles you have, we didn't count up the imperviousness of the tombstones, but, from the drives and parkings and stuff, we really found that those were, not considerably higher, but a good bit higher, maybe around 25% or so. And then finally, I have this slide, and this is the last one before I'll hand it back off to Brik. But these are showing what we currently are thinking for solar panel runoff coefficients. And you can see that we've done it with two different types of ground cover, gravel or native vegetation. And there are cases where you might want to use either one of those. And that we also have guidance for where you have it parallel to the contours, diagonal to the contours, and perpendicular to the contours. And I think this really shows you just how important that panel orientation is. And I feel like these are good values that we've come up with so far. I have a lot of confidence in them, but we're still conducting sensitivity analysis. We're still getting input from stakeholders, and we'd certainly be interested in any thoughts or experiences you all have with these. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Brik.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. So for those that did attend last year, I presented on this, but I will keep it short and sweet compared to last year. Just really highlighting some of the big stuff. Not going to get too much into the details and the numbers, but we're all familiar with the water quality event. It was developed in the late 80s by Ben Urbonis and Dr. Guo as part of their research to kind of understand these smaller storm hydrology events. One of the things that we found, and based on questions and feedback from others, is what is the corresponding flow for a water quality event? We can use the rational method, which is one of the options, but then there's also this understanding that we do have CUHP, a regional model that's been calibrated for us to use in different designs. There are limitations with the 5 acres, which we'll see that gets relaxed with some of these results. But I think the big things that we're finding here are that we do use this. It directly impacts how we size volume-based and flow-based stormwater control measures. So as part of the research that we did, and this will be incorporated into the new update, but for those that want to use it prior, the technical memorandum that we put together is available on our website. But we performed a water quality analysis, which is kind of this 2-part analysis that investigated rainfall to really understand storm characteristics, regional distribution. Is our 2-hour storm hydrograph appropriate? Can we use that to actually route something rather than just taking a rational method number and intensity? And so from the results that we saw there, the second part of the analysis kind of looked at the rainfall runoff comparing CUHP and the rational method. And so I think the big findings from that result, so kind of looking at the rainfall analysis only, our regional storm distribution is appropriate. Most of the storm events that we did have fell within the bounds of these lower 2-year and the 100-year kind of distribution whenever it's normalized. But really the things that influence this are actually other aspects of how we analyze statistics, the data itself, whether it's reporting at a 5-minute interval every hour. A lot of these other things do impact the results. But from what we found, the rainfall analysis that Dr. Guo put together is appropriate. And so that allowed us to incorporate this water quality design storm and compare results from CUHP versus the rational method. So the plot here that we're showing just on each of the points represent a rational method with the different times of duration. And then the lines there represent a CUHP model. So all of these, the acre and the imperviousness, or acreage and imperviousness, were held constant, but just modifying all these other parameters to understand that the rational method really only uses a couple parameters, and those parameters are actually different than what we would use in CUHP. And so, especially whenever we're talking about these small storm hydrology, ultra-urban areas where we have really short times of duration, especially time to peak, this can definitely impact our results, especially whenever it comes to over-designing. We've also incorporated things such as manufactured treatment devices into our systems, and so being able to utilize that system at lower rates will help the whole effective system become more efficient. So those are really kind of, I think, the big things to touch on there. And so as Andrew mentioned, this is something that we are still working on. We've investigated, we've performed some literature with the support of my interns as well as the engineers at Wright. But kind of we would love to get your input. We've talked a little bit about how the imperviousness, it is the foundational parameter that we use in design. It affects everything from the size of your facility to the size of your inlets and so on. And so making sure that we actually are capturing the right value, we're selecting that through the right process and methodology is really important. In everything from hydrologic scale to the actual model or equations that we're using do affect the results. And so as part of this chapter update, which we'll see at the end of the year, we've incorporated a lot of these other things, the water quality event, impacts of development, and kind of supporting information to validate those results that we're seeing. And so with that, here's some questions that just to pose to everybody, at least for right now, like are the numbers that we're going to send out, are these appropriate? Are there thoughts from others? I would definitely love to get more input. I know Andrew and I both would, just to make sure that we get, similar to our criteria manual update for all the stormwater control measures, get input from our stakeholders, because this is something that does affect everybody. So with that, thank you very much.